Hello and welcome to the HR People Pod, the CIPD's fortnightly podcast, bringing you the topical stories, expert insights on issues impacting the people profession and the world of work. My name's David D'Souza, I'm Director of Profession at the CIPD, and joining me in the studio we have...
Mel Steel. Hello, glad to be back.
And we have...
David Blackburn. Lovely to be back, David.
And whilst you are both multiple attendees, could you just give the audience a bit of an understanding of your background?
Yeah, I'm a career interim. Prior to that, I was an HR director, chief people officer, and now I specialise in change and transformation.
Fantastic. David?
But like Mel, I've been around for longer than I care to remember. I'm a chartered companion of the CIPD, and for the last 2 years, I've been an independent consultant.
Fantastic. And I was thinking that Blackburn and Steel sounds like some kind of 70s
it does.
TV show, doesn't it? Like that's
it does. I like that.
Or a series of murder mystery books. That could kind of work as well. So brilliant to have you both back on the show. The CIPD has recently launched a new campaign, which we're calling HR30, which is to recognise and celebrate HR leaders who've made a fantastic impact within the year. If you know someone to nominate, then please look that up on our website. It's not hard to find. But from time to time, we see headlines bashing the profession and the role it plays in organisations, or doubting or not understanding that. At times, the role can be a little bit thankless. There's a lovely quote, isn't there, which is, if you want thanks, don't take on a thankless job. It shouldn't be like that to work in the profession, but some days I know it might be. So I'd like to start this show with just a little bit of you sharing what you think the best of what the profession is to offer. So if I could ask you both to share a story, whether it's a personal story or whether it's kind of a peer that you've got in mind, of someone who deserves a shout out or has done brilliant stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Look, there's a lot of good work that goes on. Unfortunately, most of the time, due to lots of reasons, it doesn't always get out there. I wanted to talk about an example, which was something that actually I was able to hear about at a conference. But it was about a business that was going through change. They were changing their engineers, no longer needed to go to people's homes to provide different services, and they could do it remotely. And the operations director said, we will need to make these people redundant. So quite a lot of people to make redundant. And the CPO said, well, hang on, let's just step back and think if there's a different way we could do that. Why don't we look at whether there's an opportunity to reskill these people, which the business was a little bit horrified about thinking about. Even more so, the finance director felt that wasn't going to be a quick win. And of course, he was right with that. But to cut a long story short, basically a third of them wanted to take redundancy anyway. The next third were up for reskilling. And then the third kind of decided to do different things. But the third that they reskilled did so exceptionally well in these new roles because of the fact that they could put themselves in the situation, that their success rate was off the scale compared to those that hadn't done the role, the engineering role, personally before. That the time saved, obviously, that people didn't have to call back, or the success rate that they felt from that person giving them that advice was so high. Over time, the business case proved its worth. And what I loved about them coming with this case study was the fact that they decided to come 2 years after it had happened. So it came with that data. Because typically people sometimes come a bit too early when they've just done it.
Here's the thing we're currently doing.
Yes.
Or here's the thing we're thinking about.
And she was really open about, look, probably when you look at cost at that beginning, it was difficult. It wasn't without it. Saying a third obviously decided they lost it. They was hoping it'd be like 2/3 in that. But actually what they then realised was these were the people that they needed to train, who they then hired to do this role in the future. The CPO was always focused about two things, the customer service and what's the right thing to do with the people. She was honest. The pressure was on to just get rid, because the people that were made redundant were gone. But actually the morale that it built, where some people were being reskilled, was the baseline of how they then told their story about their workforce.
Excellent. So we're going to be speaking a lot today about redundancy and change. And that's a brilliant place to start us off. David, what's your heartening or cheerful story?
Well, first, actually, I've got an interesting statistic linked to reskilling.
You're coming on with statistics.
I am.
Nice to see the prep.
So great piece of research by PwC last year. So when asked CEOs, globally CEOs, what's the number one thing that's keeping you awake at night? And 74% of CEOs say skills. Lack of the right skill and thing. Yet, if you ask the same organizations, only 14% of organizations are actually investing in reskilling.
Yeah.
And I love anything to do. So actually, funnily enough, and Mel and I hadn't rehearsed this, my story is a bit similar, but I am going to name somebody specifically. So Jane Casserell is the Executive Director of People and Culture at the Bank of England. And Jane has been in post for about 5 years. Apologies, Jane, if I got that wrong.
I'm assuming this is going to be a good story about Jane, not just like naming Jane.
No, it's a great story. So this is one of the reasons. So actually, it's very much about skills. So the future skills that the bank, as the central bank, needs across its whole 16 professional communities. So it's creating professional communities, including a people professional community. What does it mean to be a people professional in the bank? And also having some really interesting discussions around saying, so actually, if these are the skills that we think we need as HR professionals, what skills do we also think that our leaders need from this suite of people skills? So not just the skills that we need, but actually, if you're going to lead a team or be a manager, what things cross over? Actually, if you're a data professional or you're a people professional, what data skills do you need amongst these various sets? But the big shout out really is that not only is she progressing that work and has appointed Natasha to lead on that, and Jess Bennion, who I've worked with, this is against a backdrop of the bank over the course of the last year phasing out its final salary pension scheme. And I know there'd be people falling over with gasps going, oh my God, did anybody have a final salary pension scheme? Yes, the Bank of England did. And I know that it has been 2 years of Jane's life to lead that negotiation in a unionised environment.
Tough.
What really tough. So I think sometimes we have these great examples and case studies of things that are really powerful and at the same time, actually, lots of HR professionals are having to do that. It's like changing the wheels on the car while the car is still moving.
Yeah.
At the same time as dealing with some really, really complex stuff and negotiating with the unions and landing a pay deal and all of that stuff. And I just think she does it with panache.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. In those surveys of what keeps you up at night, no one ever says like the washing machine's too loud. Like there's never anything really mundane. What's keeping you up at the moment? Oh, my partner snores. It seems like a more reasonable one to have in there. It's worth calling out actually some of the work that goes on, I think, behind the scenes, because it's really interesting, isn't it? Like when you think about that, I've seen HR directors step towards genuine issues with sexual harassment at a systemic kind of level. I've seen lives saved by actually negotiations with insurers and healthcare providers. None of that stuff tends to get circulated. Yeah. It's not a good news story.
It's not newsworthy,
is it? It's not. No. But actually, the impact it can have on people's lives. I've seen people intervene at absolutely important, critical career decisions, and people then, years after being thankful for that conversation. That's the heart of the job that I think often doesn't get covered. So that said, the job does have profound impacts on people's lives. We discussed recently on a recent episode a decline in business confidence, and largely as a result of either choppy or uncertain economic or political conditions, because those two things go together. Businesses have been quite vocal about the fact it will be a difficult year coming up, particularly in the UK, which will mean some difficult decisions to be made. The CIPD's latest labour market outlook, which we publish on a quarterly basis, confirms that direction of travel for the UK. So it's the worst set of results that we've seen in a decade, beyond or outside of the pandemic, where obviously that had a quite exceptional impact, including impacts on retail and hospitality. So we essentially ask businesses, what are you doing? What are you thinking about this? What's going to come next? And more than a third of businesses plan to reduce their headcount through redundancy or through recruiting fewer staff. Organisations have got a good chunk of time to reflect on the impact that any increase in cost is likely to have. To your point, Mel, there's a kind of long-term and a short-term thing playing out here, which is the obvious thing to do if you want to get your costs down is to look at how you can cut costs. that might be different to what's healthy for your organisation over the next 5 years. Equally, there are no doubt some times that you have to kind of make some difficult choices. Mel, I'll start with you because that was a really good example. How do organisations make sure that they are looking at the medium and long term rather than the short term when there's obvious pressure?
Yeah, well, I think this is where HR play that business role a little bit in that room, because I think numbers start to kick in, right? And balance sheets become the top, which I'm okay to start with because my starting position is about profit, because it gets me a bit angry. And then you also know I'm like, I am absolutely kind of open that in a world of businesses need to make profit. It's not a dirty word, right? That's just how life is. But equally, I am starting to get a little bit angry when I'm reading some of these situations where they're like, we've got no choice because of, costs going up, which we know is true. We've got to make redundancies. And then I'm like, well, how much profit is this company making? And, a lot of businesses are back to pre-profit, pre-pandemic profit, right? So to me, I don't think that's doing really badly. So I think there is a context bit. I think, bigger picture of when we start talking about, are we basing we're not doing very well based on the profit side of things?
It's interesting. So there's that, when an organisation says we have no choice but,
yeah.
Some organisations will have no choice but.
Yeah.
Some organisations will have actually a choice to take that they're framing in that way.
Yeah. And I think, as the bigger questions have to be asked. I'm not for 1 minute kind of saying, that you get very far with that. But I think someone has to put that on the table of like, well, hang on, the starting point is, if it is a company that's making profit or washing its face, let's look at the bigger question first and ask ourselves, are we doing everything? Are we being realistic about, is our shareholder being realistic? And you can always ask that question, right? And I think we shouldn't just take it as a thing, because you're putting that on the table saying, okay, we're business people here. Can we defend that, first of all, in our own minds? Because actually we're going to have to defend it when we get out there and start telling people why we're doing it. So let's be authentic in our approach of it. And it always it does shock me when I ask that question and challenge that, to the CEOs. They're like, yeah, but we're never making enough. And see, that's where the greed bit, you've got to start opening that conversation. And then I think the conversation has to go to, the short-term bit of what you can do, you take the numbers out, you pass on the costs to the consumer if you're able to do that. But I also like them to look at then what about the longer term side of it? Because actually what we know is there's a lot of talk at the moment about efficiency, productivity. It's like the new in word, right? And, I've been quite vocal in the last couple of weeks about, that's not a cost-cutting exercise. You have to invest in parallel to driving efficiency and productivity. And it does come, and we've seen that with digital transformation, right, over the last few years of businesses that have heavily invested in that and are now starting to see the benefits of that from their consumers, really loving the service they're getting, the way they've made things more efficient and streamlined, etc. But you don't get that quick hit on the balance sheet.
And the quick hit's really attractive, isn't it? Right?
Always.
Because the quick hit says we've solved a problem. The quick hit says we're decisive.
And look, sometimes I've been in businesses where they've got, 2 months of cash left to pay people, and they don't have much choice.
Yeah, doing something in 3 months isn't
no
an
choice.
option.
Me kind of saying to them, hey, have you thought about, driving? So, kind of putting on the table, what is it we're trying to solve for here? Because I always then will talk to them, let's not underestimate the impact of getting rid, which is the horriblest expression there is, because getting rid of people translates into people having to have one-on-one conversations and blowing people's lives apart typically, right? So, when you actually get into the detail of it, it is one of the toughest things that you have to do as a manager or in HR to do that.
Yeah, it's there's a lovely one of the organisations that I would say struggled through the last financial crisis. You kind of recognise the name for it. I kind of visited their offices, and they had up on the wall, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. They had, "How will the decisions made in this room look in 10 years' time?" And I thought that was just a brilliant way of starting to focus people's attention, not just on what's the immediate problem in front of us, but actually looking back. Would you think we've done the right thing, the mature thing, the kind of considered thing around that space?
We use these terms interchangeably, effectiveness and efficiency and productivity, and actually, what do we really mean by those terms? And actually, just reducing your overall costs or cutting your balance sheet is not efficiency. That doesn't mean that you are necessarily going to be more efficient or more effective or more productive. And actually, ironically, the thing, I totally agree with the observation about investment. All of the studies say, that one of the big reasons that UK PLC is a laggard in terms of productivity is poor management. And what's the first thing? We were talking about it earlier. What's the first thing you cut? Oh, I know, we cut the training budget. Let's get rid of the learning development professionals. We won't invest in the thing. We're not taking a longer term view. And I think, and also the only other thing that occurred to me is that, we don't have a choice. There's so much in the press right now. It's all the national insurance increase. It's all the fault of the national insurance increase. That's the reason why we've got to lay people off. Or it's all the fault of the minimum wage. Now, that's a whole other episode talking about, what do we think is the, sustainable position. And, but surely we as a society want to, pay people a fair and wage for what they do. I just think that, again, is an easy thing for employers to go, oh, it's that, therefore we must do this, without us going, do you? Really? Because actually, if you're going to have to accommodate that, where you get accommodation that from, can't you reduce your profit margin? Or even in not-for-profit organisations, and I've worked with lots of charities where you take a view about what's the amount of reserves that you have, or what's the amount of capital, and how many months of operating expenses that you have, and all of that sort of good stuff. I think very rarely, only Mel's absolutely right. If you're an organisation where you've only got 2 months payroll, well, then perhaps I would go, you haven't got a choice. But I think in most other circumstances, there probably are other options.
And that's the key word to me, options.
Yeah.
So being an old timer now around the table, in my early career, redundancies, were part of the norm, really, unfortunately. It was a difficult time. A lot of industries were changing, a lot of cost cutting. It was a tough environment. And thank goodness we've had quite a few years, of what I'd say considerable growth and, different times. But actually, we learned our skills on really about efficiency and productivity. And one of the things we'd always do is the option.
Yeah.
So what is it we're trying to achieve? And I mean, from a business perspective, not just, and the answer wasn't default redundancies, crack on HR, off you go. It was an exercise, a proper options piece where you looked at what are we trying to solve for? What are we trying to achieve? And what's the timeline that we'd get from A to B? And we would, in that option piece, look at things like impact. Impact of an organisation going through redundancies or taking people out. I will often say to an organisation, actually, you think that's hard? What happens afterwards actually is hard too, because it has such an impact on the people that are going, but also those that are remaining too. And whilst you might have moved on in the boardroom because on the balance sheet you see the people have gone in numbers and the costs are reduced, you are still a business that then needs to be productive and needs to inspire these people to continue. And, in markets where they're difficult, they might not leave you straight away, but that will hang in the air for considerably longer than what the top team
than just the
think
number
about
that
it.
you're looking at
Yeah.
on the balance sheet.
Going to talk a little bit about the emotional impact now, just to kind of round off the conversation. But I think there are a few key points that came out from that. One, genuinely do evaluate your options. Secondly, look at short, medium and long-term impacts of what you're doing. And thirdly, particularly in terms of the profession making a case for things, if you're going to end up with a smaller amount of people, you're going to want those people to be excellent at what they do, in which case L&D, OD, looking after people's well-being, they're at the heart of making sure that actually the people you've got left can perform in difficult circumstances.
And that, sorry, the last bit on that one, I just say that knee-jerk bit that anyone who provides support services are the easy target. Because actually having very senior people and expecting them to do things which takes them 10 times as long, when actually you could have, you know, a very small and nimble team that, you know, it just because there's technology, yes, that helps them, but actually makes no sense having, you know, the most senior directors and we say, well, everyone can self-serve themselves. Well, yes, to a point, but then we also have to go to value of work and what are jobs and what are they made up of and what skills.
If your CEO could theoretically do their own paperwork, book their own travel, but actually, given the amount you're paying your CEO, is that the best return for the organisation?
Yeah.
So, following on from this and kind of linked ahead, so it's kind of a focus on redundancy and change this time. There's a story surfacing around Southwest Airlines, an organisation that were once famed for leading with love. There's a lovely book by Ken Blanchard, I think, if you want to kind of think about how you can get care and congruent results kind of running through an organisation. But they're making their first set of layoffs in the company's 53-year history. Don't want to talk specifically around Southwest Airlines, but there's obviously you talked about it, well, when you have to do it for the first time. It used to be maybe more common. We're coming into a period where there may be more redundancies happening. In terms of the emotional journey that practitioners go through, what does it feel like to know that it's coming or likely, know that you're going to have to do it, and then to go through it? Because there'll be people listening to this podcast that haven't done it. I think all of us have done it, regrettably, multiple times. My tip would be that you get used to it, but you never get all the way used to it. Like, it still hurts. It's still uncomfortable. And quite frankly, I'd suggest that if it isn't, then you don't care enough. Someone once said to me, the trick is to just care enough. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. You don't care enough. That's a problem. You care too much. That's equally a problem. There's something in the middle. But when you're having to do it, when you're having to deal with those difficult situations, the anticipation, the kind of journey through it, talk us through that.
I always say, because I've been made redundant myself, and actually whenever I'm hoping that not every HR professional ever has been made redundant, but actually there is something about having gone through the experience. And actually when I'm talking to people, that's pretty much what I always open with. I say, I have been in the seat that you're sitting in right now and have been through that journey. And I love your observation, David, about how much you care, because if you care too much, and you're absolutely right, this isn't about not caring. I think you do absolutely want to, be empathetic and put yourself in the shoes of those individuals. And because each individual journey is personal. And the minute you say redundancy or restructure or reorganization, people are immediately leaping to the mortgage, the school fees, the bills. All of that. How is my life going to work, beyond this decision, and what's the settlement amount and how long will that last me, and all of those sorts of things. That's immediately what happens. So I think holding people's hands through that journey. But if you're doing this on scale, you realistically cannot hold the hands of 400 people or 300 people without you becoming a completely, it destroying you. And I think one of the things that I've always done, I think back to what we were saying earlier about, have you explored all the options and shown this thing? I always say everyone might not agree with what the organization is doing. They might not, but actually, if you as the practitioner really understand the business rationale, if you really get why you're doing it, why it's happening, and you're able to explain that, in terms that everybody can understand. So I've got loads of examples from my years working in social housing where we were making people redundant on a pretty regular basis because in an environment where you are commissioned by local authorities to provide services, those services go up for tender. You know, in the early 2000s, when there was a race for the bottom, you know, local authorities paying less and less and less and less, housing providers basically just said, we can't provide this service anymore. We absolutely can't do it whether we want to or not. So sometimes that might mean that you cheap it out, but then sometimes it meant that we're making people redundant. I think being really transparent is absolutely essential. I think don't come up with, as Mel said, you know, not just you making some decisions in the executive space, but unless it's completely sensitive, you know, business sensitive, legally privileged, you should tell them everything. You should say, this is what's going on, because I think the more you're able to say, so even it still makes it painful for you as an individual, I think the more you're able to say, this is horrible, but this is why, and this is how we can support you. And I think I think that helps with your own ability to go home and say, was the conversations that I've had today, were they good conversations? Were they supportive conversations? And did I do the best that I can do as a practitioner?
How do you feel when you go home?
I mean, it's exhausting. It is exhausting. The emotional burden that we carry as practitioners, and the burnout in the profession and all of that sort of stuff, is because actually it is difficult. You're not, there aren't numbers. To Mel's point, it's not, you know, get rid of 400 or, you know, each one of those is an individual, and it's their livelihood, and it's their life story, and it's their family, and it's all of that stuff. So if you take all of that on, and I think that's why I think it's so important to have boundaries. You know, you have to be able to, you know, compartmentalize. You do have to be able to switch off, and not everybody finds that as easy. I've learned over years to be able to go, okay, I need to park again, another people point, I think discussion is had about, you know, do you bring your full self or do you bring your professional self to work? You know, that whole thing, you know, I think, you know, but I think if you know, even if it will always be difficult. I think I guess that's my final observation. I think if you know it's always going to be difficult, and as you've said, I don't think it gets. I guess it gets easier because you've got more experience in doing it. I don't think it emotionally gets easier, and I'm not sure necessarily that it should. But
yeah,
I think
I'm not anxious.
Yeah.
You get confident in the process. Yeah. You understand what you're going to go through, but it's still to your point.
But I think knowing that up front, I think is a good thing. Is going, okay, this is what it's going to be like, and it is going to impact me.
Mel, what about you? And again, kind of focusing on as a practitioner doing it.
Yeah, I think I go practical in the sense of there are so many people in our profession that have never done it. And thank God that they've had time where they haven't. You know, many of us started our career where we did a lot of it. And so you end up learning different skills, right, at different times in your career due to how the economy might be. The first thing I say is, you know, it needs to be planned out. This doesn't happen easily. And by that, I mean not the process, but how are you going to support that emotional? So first thing I always say is, you know, HR practitioners have to put their own oxygen mask on first. They cannot help others if they don't feel in themselves. So training HR practitioners on what is it in terms of the technical side of redundancy, because there's a lot of people, even if they did it as part of their qualifications, probably didn't pay that much attention to it because it seemed like quite a dated thing, which I don't blame them for, because we were in, you know, realms of growth and entrepreneurship and everything was rosy, you know. So I think going back to basics, understanding, teaching practitioners about what is redundancy, and then as we're talking about the human side of it. So how should you feel? And about, you know, if you ever go home and you don't get any feelings about how challenging it is, then you're probably in the wrong job. I agree with that. It never gets any easier. But also, what type of support are we going to put around you? So there will always be people like us who may have done it more, unfortunately. And therefore we feel confident maybe in the approach, and we know we've been through it, so we know that there's a good way of doing it, which sounds terrible, but there is, and there's a terrible way of doing it, and we see some of that maybe in the US, kind of, you turn up, you're gone,
Yeah.
bye. Although some of that behaviour is kind of coming over into the UK side of things, which was never how we did it. So I think oxygen mask on first. How are we going to upskill? How are we going to support? So, being on a plan, in a sense, every Friday we're going to get together. It's just time for you to say, how has it gone this week? What did you need to do? And them having an option to have a one-to-one about, I just had to do this terrible call. It caught me unawares. It does. Sometimes you feel very emotional. When there was one time in COVID when I was helping a client and I got an SOS from one of the team. She said, I had the worst call. I started telling him he unfortunately had been selected with his manager on the call, but the manager was completely silent. Of course, it was all being done remotely. And he said, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to pause because my wife's just gone into labour. And she said, everything that had been happening just made me, she said, I just started sobbing. I just thought, oh my God, I'm breaking this whole family apart. And she was one of the least people I would kind of say that would, feel like that, but it catches you. So her being able to come and have a conversation about how it affected her, I think is really key. And sometimes we miss that bit about how, and then the other most important bit, side of the coin, managers have to take responsibility in this situation. So, HR have to be shoulder to shoulder to both the employee and the manager, but the manager has to take accountability for these conversations too. And therefore, it's really important that we train the managers and really ensure that they feel supported too through it, because the people will then, obviously, employees will want to talk to them about it. And they carry the same, emotional turmoil. If any managers ever made anyone redundant, then no one ever says, oh, that was easy to do. And again, being really clear about how will we train those managers, not just on the technical approach, but on that, the human side, about what reactions you might get from people, the silence, or the people might just go mad on you. You never know how an individual might respond when you're telling them this situation.
So I absolutely agree about the training for both managers and HR professionals. I just think also, in order to have the space to be your best human, you do absolutely have to be really confident about the law and the technical elements of it, in order, so actually that's not what you're thinking about, going, oh my God, what if they ask me a technical question, that that stuff. And equally, we should never forget that redundancy actually is a business process that HR is enabling and facilitating. And I just think that's such an important point, that it's not just you do it, that it's too often, and we've all been in that situation where it's like, there you are, HR, you go and sort it out. No, it should be absolutely, as Mel exactly said, shoulder to shoulder with the line manager and the business.
We're going to come on to something a little bit more lighthearted now, but just before we do that, all right, 'cause there was something going through my mind when we were talking about like the impact. Just one or two sentences from each of you. Is it easier, harder, or the same to do it for a smaller number of people versus larger?
Oh,
and I mean emotionally.
Yeah, I think it's the same but different. If that's not, so I think if you've worked in a smaller if you're working in an organisation of 50 people, everyone really knows each other. I think it's emotionally draining and difficult no matter the size, but I do think it's slightly different having worked in SMEs and small. The relationships are very intense, and so you do know everybody's backstory that you're talking to, and I think that sometimes adds an additional weight, because you're like, oh God, it's Mel and her husband and ex, you know the backstory of people. I think that makes it hard.
No?
I think it's the same, because you just have a mini companies within companies, right? So the person who is closest to supporting that business with that change is going to feel it. You then become the support mechanism for many people. You do have to sometimes stop yourself, I think it'd be fair to say, when you're in that top role, to not fall into the numbers bit yourself. I mean, you're not, because you are there, but is it the difference between 400 or 2,000 and that? the reality strikes is when you're sat round or you have a couple of those personal conversations, maybe with your team who are out there doing those conversations. So it's same but different.
Yeah. We're going to close off today talking about, well, we have a regular section. It's called Is It a Thing? Where we ask the simple question, is it a thing?
Is it a thing?
We now have a jingle.
Has it got a jingle? It should have a jingle, David.
Is it a thing? Yeah. Is it a thing? That may be taken.
We're so creative in the HR.
Honestly, it's just a hub of excellence in this room. We're going to be talking about mini retirement. So it's come up a bit more recently, I think, with people thinking about taking, it's a long career. Do I take 3 months out? Do I take 6 months out? Maybe smaller than a traditional sabbatical. Equally, there's I can only describe this as a micro retirement. Going to quote Gary Neville. For example, this weekend, I'm heading to Spain from Friday to Monday morning. It's like a mini retirement. It's a short break where for 3 days I can be fully present and not focus on work, though ideas often come to me during these trips. In about 6 weeks, I'll take another mini retirement of 4 to 5 days. Instead of planning a long 6-month sabbatical, I take shorter breaks more frequently. I mean, they're known as either weekends or annual leave to most of us. But to Gary Neville, with that work ethic, they're mini retirements. But is it a thing? Do you think taking, let's go longer than 2 days for obvious reasons, but taking 2 or 3 months breaks at sporadic points throughout people's career might be a good way of managing your energy and the way that you think about work?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a top 1% type problem, I think, when you look at Gary Neville and kind of thing. But I think what I do love seeing, now about different generations is their desire to work differently and actually really taking opportunity of traveling and working if they can. And I know that's not possible for everyone, but even people who are in a job where it doesn't allow them to do, they're saving money, maybe doing that sabbatical piece as well. But they seem I think social media's kind of publicised that a bit more. And I think people do have a desire to experience different things. And financially, that's not the only driver because you can do it on quite a small budget. And I think on the other flip side, everyone's working longer. A lot of people financially are having to work longer too, right? Because of maybe, their plans aren't quite what they wanted them to be. And I think having that ability to do balance, which I think the younger generation has really taught us something about. I mean, for my generation, which was always about work. And then, they seem to have that balance a bit more. I think it can only be a good thing.
David, is it a thing? Is it a thing?
Is it a thing? Yeah, I think it is. I'm not sure whether I'd call it. Yes, I think mini retirement's an interesting term. But Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott, 100-Year Life. What year did they publish that? 2017. And they said, we're going to all live longer. The 3-stage, life journey: education, work, retirement, will be defunct. And I agree with Mel. Actually, there's something more about beyond that concept about just wider flexibility. So actually, the 200, whatever it is, 200 of the organisations who did the 4-day working week pilot are permanently adopting it. Even though everyone's at the same time saying get back to the office anyway. And I've got friends who aren't in the top 1%. They're IT consultants. And they travel endlessly and work from different places. They just say, we're going to go an Airbnb somewhere in, Gran Canaria or go into.
I mean, it sounds a little bit 1%y. I'm just putting it out.
They're not. When I say they're not like independent IT consultants, they work for a company and they do IT. But you can do it from anywhere. And I know that's not every job, as Mel says. But I think some people actually are returning to the workplace because actually they go, if we're going to live, my pension is not going to sustain me because I might live another 20 years. Actually, I might have to go back to work. And, and I just think, that's not sustainable in the long term unless you have a bit of a break and says a man who spends time working in France anyway. So
lovely to have you here today. So that's all from us today. I'd like to thank our guests, the Blackburn and Steel Detective Agency, for sharing their thoughts on some really challenging topics. I really appreciate you talking in such a raw way, actually, about the experience of working in the profession. We've got a wealth of resources available to members supporting you for a number of issues we've discussed today. We've got more on the LMO and the detail there that you can find readily on the website, but you'll also find a suite of supporting guidance and practical resources around change management in particular. We updated that at the start of the year with more tools for practitioners, so do make sure that you take heed of that. Publish new episodes of this podcast every fortnight or so make sure that you follow or subscribe. We're now on YouTube, and I believe we may also be on Audible as well, but I'm pretty sure they'll edit this bit out if we aren't. I'm David D'Souza. This has been the HR People Pod. Thank you very much for listening.